Majoring in Africana, Puerto Rican, and Latino studies at Hunter College was a transformational experience for me as an undergrad. So I wanted to express gratitude to all the pioneers who helped make that experience possible. I'm currently a PhD candidate in sociology at the CUNY Graduate Center. My dissertation is on the struggle for Puerto Rican studies at CUNY and is based on oral histories that I'm conducting with former students, activists, faculty, and administrators who fought for and helped establish Puerto Rican studies. In my work, I explore how movement participants challenged colonial discourses in higher education, advanced emancipatory knowledge and practices, and responded to the material needs of local communities. I'm interested in how practitioners fought against racist and colonial ideas about Puerto Ricans, such as those mentioned in the film and in the previous presentation. But we know that the point of challenging those discourses isn't just to correct the historical record, diversify curriculum, or gain legitimacy in academia, because colonial discourses are developed to perpetuate colonial relations, to justify political domination and economic exploitation. So I'm interested in how Puerto Rican studies and other critical education projects can be used to disrupt those oppressive social relations and contribute to movements for decolonization and social justice. The Puerto Rican student movement, like the student movements that emerged from the Black, Chicano, Indigenous, and Asian American communities, were intertwined with larger radical movements by people of color in the United States during the late 1960s, often referred to as the Third World Left. The word inclusion is used a lot today to describe the movement that led to open admissions and Black and Puerto Rican studies at CUNY, but the current language of diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher education can't easily be mapped onto the movement's politics. The demands weren't just for equal access or inclusion. There was a very intentional effort to challenge existing power dynamics and transform the university into a more democratic and collectively governed institution. The first demand of the struggle at City College was for an independent school of Black and Puerto Rican studies to be controlled by students, community, and faculty. The fourth demand at Brooklyn College was also for autonomous Afro-American and Puerto Rican studies institutes controlled by students, community, and faculty. In a publication titled New Knowing, New Practice, Puerto Rican Studies, founding director of El Centro, Frank Bonilla, and Emilio González described Puerto Rican studies as an intellectual and political project based on, quote, the deprofessionalization and destructuring of instruction, the engagement of community people in the planning and development of programs, the collective spirit of work and decision-making among all involved, unquote. So in my work, I'm attempting to uncover how those pro-Puerto Rican independence, anti-imperialist, and anti-capitalist values played out on the campus and in the community. I ask what were the successes and shortcomings and what lessons can we learn from that struggle. This 50th anniversary is a great time to revisit the early visions and mission of Puerto Rican studies and think about how these principles of activist research and community service, anti-racist critical pedagogy, and democratic collective governance can be applied to our current context. How can we continue to honor and build on that legacy? What are the social movements and struggles that Puerto Rican studies should be engaging with today? I'll end there and open it up for the last question and answer period of the evening. Thank you. So let's see, returning to the Q&A. And Professors Pérez y González and Sanchez-Korrol will join me as well as the filmmakers.
Hello.
Okay. I think we're all here.
Yes.
So one of the first questions is how has Puerto Rican Studies kept relationships with Puerto Rican programs and universities on the island?
I can begin. That's a general question.
Yeah, that's a general question.
It
General question.
depends. It
Yeah.
depends on the program, and it's not a institutionalized in the same way. You know, it depends on the college and the department, the program. So I know that some colleges do have relationships with the university systems in Puerto Rico, but I think it's more a person to person basis. And CUNY used to have the inter-university, what was it, the exchange, intercambio, right? Centro had intercambio. I don't think that's been around for a while, but it used to be that we would exchange students with the University of Puerto Rico and they would come here. I'm not sure that's functioned much anymore. So the ties are not as, from what I understand, the ties are not as well kept as it could be. It's more on an individual program or departmental basis. So while yes, our faculty and our students go to Puerto Rico, they do study abroad, they do that kind of thing. It's less formal than than it could be. It could be much more formalized.
Yeah, one of the ways that that the intercambio did work when it was more active than it is now was by doing joint research projects together, so that grant proposals were written to do a certain research project. I know I was on a number of them that were researching women's history, and that allowed us to join and meet and interact with our counterparts in Puerto Rico who were researching the same topic, but basically we had no other connection except the intercambio. Now, the intercambio worked very, very well in terms of publishing the works that came out of that research. And we also had programs where students would go and spend the semester in Puerto Rico. These type of programs, for the most part, need funding, so that you have to have some kind of grant to help you do it. The universities are strapped for money. They do not put money into this type of exchange, but it is something that we felt was necessary for the benefits of the field. And so through Centro, our institutions are so vital because our institutions are in a symbiotic relationship with the departments. The Centro was able to fund many of these other types of exchange programs that we had, but it's something that I think has to be looked at and really encouraged for the future, particularly now where the relationships between diaspora and archipelago are so close and so united in terms of goals.
Will Puerto Rican and Latino studies ever be offered as a master's program in Brooklyn College, Hunter College, or elsewhere at CUNY?
There was an attempt to have a master's program, but it became more generally known. Actually, it happened in institutions that were not CUNY. So that if you wanted to get a PhD in Puerto Rican studies, you would go the route of ethnic studies or Latinx studies, or you would go into a joint program where there were several roads leading to the PhD. Those are found in California. They're found in state universities in New York. And in fact, one of the chapters in the book talks about aspects like that, and talks about that's it beyond CUNY, talks about what's happened in Puerto Rican studies, Latino studies, Latinx, ethnic studies, beyond Puerto Rican studies.
Someone would like to know about the relationship between the struggle for Puerto Rican studies and El Centro. Can someone speak to that history?
Yes, I can start that, I guess. The Puerto Rican Studies, right? As we started to establish, Lehman was the first one, and Lehman College, was the first department of Puerto Rican Studies in CUNY, and that was even before the CUNY mandate. They had established it, so about a month or so before the CUNY mandate that said, okay, now you can open up, and you can establish institutes, programs, departments. And then was Hunter Colleges, right? Department of Black and Puerto Rican Studies, and then Brooklyn College, and so on. So, right, the few of us that were around, and mind you, City College didn't have a department of Puerto Rican Studies. They established it differently, so it was a program, right, of Puerto Rican Studies. So while City College was very active, and the activism, was, a lot about that because they have a lot of footage and all of that. They didn't become a department until later. So the departments themselves, yes, they got together. The programs got together. Josie Nieves, our very first, right, Puerto Rican Studies chairperson that you saw focused in the film, she called together, it was in Brooklyn College's sort of office where these ideas were thrown around, and there was a plan created for a research center. And basically that blossomed then, right? That group of people came together and said, we need Puerto Rican Studies Centro, right? And it wasn't only CUNY people, it was from the other places outside of CUNY too that had established, right, Puerto Rican Studies. So they created a plan and they presented it, and it got funded. Was it the Ford Foundation of Virginia? I forget who it was at this point, but it was funded by a grant, and that helped establish El Centro. And so, of course, Frank Bonilla becomes the first director, but that's basically how that began. So the Hunter, somebody had in the chat, the Q&A about the relationship between the department at Hunter and the Centro. The department came first, right? So, and so that's how Centro was created. People came together, they needed a think tank, they wanted a place where they can, flourish with their publications and their scholarship, and so the Centro was created, and it's blossomed quite well. So I'm looking forward to continue to blossom.
Well, I have now been connected with Brooklyn College for some 45 actual years as a faculty member. And I was there as a student for another additional 5 years. So that in terms of struggles, Centro plays a key role for departments and programs by providing materials, providing research, providing programs. A number of organizations that have involved Centro staff and faculty have come about, lived the life, written reports, and and eventually dissolved. But in terms of conflict, yeah, I'd like to know more about that. So maybe whoever wrote the question can add to it.
I'll also add that one of the principles of collective work and democratic governance was also very present in the founding and early years of Centro, where there was the use of task forces, right, to produce very important reports based on community needs, and these were collectively authored research policy briefs and work. Again, just reflecting the collective, the value of collective work and collectivity, and trying to challenge hierarchical processes and structures in higher education, trying to make things more democratic. There was also a lot of student input into the founding of El Centro and community input. So that's a good question. I'm going to combine two other questions that are related. Can you talk a little more about the beyond?
Wait, could I just go back to that question Absolutely. That you were asking?
Sure.
In terms of the task forces, Many of us faculty members worked on the task forces. I worked on the history task force while I was a grad student, so that the composition of the task forces, there were 4 original ones, and then they expanded to different subject areas. The composition of the task forces included faculty, graduate students, and researchers at Centro. The book, Labor Under Capitalism, is one that I worked on as a grad student, so that these task forces were not just made up of Centro researchers. They led the research project, but many of us got to work in it. So that's the type of relationship that I was thinking of as a counter to conflict or what were the problems, or there's a lot of interchange between the departments, especially from the time that I became involved in Puerto Rican Studies at Brooklyn College, which was 1978, until the present, where I'm still involved. So that's curious to me. I guess I just didn't understand.
Thank you. And so the next questions are, can you talk a little bit more about the beyond CUNY part of the book, and combining that with another person's question, saying that as Puerto Ricans continue to migrate and settle into the diaspora in new destinations like Utah, Arizona, Texas, how do you envision the reach of Puerto Rican studies in these areas?
Well, I guess you want to take that, Maria?
Well,
you start.
Okay,
you start.
I'll start with the easier one.
Yeah.
The person who is writing about beyond CUNY, right? The beyond CUNY system in terms of Puerto Rican studies is Edna Costa Belén, historian, right? Prominent historian that we have in our community, and so she talks about Rutgers, right? She talks about various places where Puerto Rican studies developed. Albany, SUNY, right? So she gives a good historical background with key people in different places at different universities that contributed to Puerto Rican studies. So that she does talk about the actual programs and departments, but she also talks about some individual faculty, right, that were sort of doing their work within the larger university system, contributing to Puerto Rican studies scholarship, but they were not themselves necessarily in a Puerto Rican studies department, or program. So that's part of what she covers, and it's very nice, a very nice, rounded, well-rounded, right? Sort of a longer scope into how Puerto Rican studies developed and how that worked around the Northeast in particular, right? Mostly the Northeast.
The Northeast, and actually the Midwest as well. When we go into that, you know, what's fascinating about Puerto Rican studies, and maybe this will help your question about what happens in other communities throughout. Let me tell you, Puerto Rican studies is out there. It's not only here in New York. It is out there. It is an important field of study, whether it comes under Latinx, whether it's a joint program with something else. These communities outside of New York are very, very well aware and are creating programs. I know for a fact I do a lot of consulting with universities outside of New York, creating programs that deal with the essence of Puerto Rican studies. And what was fascinating about writing the book was that we were faced with the problem Puerto Rican studies in CUNY only? What do we do with this? Because we knew that there was so much happening you're going to be really happy with this. There was so much happening throughout the country in terms of Puerto Rican studies, or Puerto Rican scholars that were going that were being hired in different parts of the country and were bringing with them that kind of background, that kind of academic knowledge, and in order to really streamline the work that we were doing, we had to concentrate only on CUNY. But you really can't do that, not when you have all of these other things happening throughout. And when you start to recognize that we have had scholars from state universities, from other universities throughout the country that have become very prominent people, they originated as Puerto Rican Studies scholars. And that was something that we are very glad that we were able to get into the book, even though we had to limit the scope of the book, given that a lot of the resources, a lot of the research, a lot of the archives are just no longer in existence. Not only are they no longer in existence, but a lot of the faculty, a lot of the pioneering faculty, or current faculty don't have a historical memory of exactly what happened. So in order to actually be able to do the work of this book, we had to make certain decisions about the scope of the book. But I'm very, very glad that we were able to include essays that really go beyond CUNY.
I'll also add, this is a very important question. I think that I would agree with Virginia that Puerto Rican Studies is being done outside of CUNY, outside of New York. As Centro has put out some really important data briefs and reports on the Puerto Rican diaspora in the United States. A lot of good information about demographics there, about emergent communities, not even emergent, large communities in Florida, in Holyoke, right, and other places. So there's a lot of good data out there already. And this is why I think that public scholarship is really important. And so there are a lot of innovative things happening, not just outside of CUNY, but outside of academia, strictly speaking, that we should be aware of and support. So I was privileged to write the foreword for a book called Caribbean Connections, Puerto Rico, which is a curricular guide for high school teachers who want to teach about Puerto Rico and social justice. And that was edited by Elisa Jimenez and of Lehigh University. And they're doing good work in Pennsylvania, in the Lehigh Valley, where there's a significant Puerto Rican population, providing resources to better service those students, right? Projects like the Puerto Rico syllabus that is distributing resources to people outside of academia who want to learn more about what's happening with the debt and what's happening with Puerto Rico. There's a lot of confusing and hard to understand information about the debt. So that's a huge service, an important project, right? So public facing scholarship like that is key. And we should do more of it. Yeah, I can say more of it. I'll stop there.
Okay, if I can just follow up on that point, and this takes in our filmmakers as well. A lot of the work that I have been doing over the past 10 years has been as a public historian. We tend to talk about Puerto Rican studies as if it can only fit in the university. And it doesn't. It doesn't. It fits in museums. It fits in public history. It fits in archaeological sites that need to have the places where some of our history begins marked, historically marked. It needs to be in the films. It needs to be in children's stories. It needs to be in novels. You're beginning to see a resurgence of this interest you could see it among the young people who are writing young adult books. It has to go beyond the university. We're not just people that work within the confines, and universities are very confined. You know, it's not just the confines of a university. You have to begin to think in terms of where do you bring your materials, to podcasts, to art, and that's the resurgence that we're seeing. You know, more and more as our young people reach an age where they're able to be productive like that. This is why the films are so important. We're not just doing a film on the impossible dream because it's timely or there's a celebration to go with it. This is going to be an archive. This is going to live on, and the work that the filmmakers are doing in this direction have to be encouraged. And we tend to, we do tend to think in a very, very confined manner, and we shouldn't be.
Well, I think that the cultural ambassador, this insignia that you see on the screen there, when Centro came out with the cultural ambassador program, I thought it was genius because they took that to the streets, and they made the students part of that, and that's fantastic. That's excellent because you do need, right, that message out there, communicating to the young and old alike. But it's a good program. So I was really happy to see that.
So we have another interesting question about how Puerto Rican studies can give us perspective on climate change, both on the island and in the United States. And this, yeah, go ahead.
Well, yes, Puerto Rican studies definitely can provide that. There are young scholars, right, who are interested in climate studies, environmental justice, as part of social justice, a part of the struggle of activism. And as we saw with Puerto Rico in 2017, after Hurricanes Irma and Maria, we know how critical that is. And so you have scholars, yes, writing about that, making that public, the aftershocks of disaster, that book, right? It's really wonderful to see that. And little did they know that the aftershocks, the earthquakes had not yet happened to the level that they did until after the book was out. So it was sort of prophetic in that way. But you have, yes, Puerto Rican studies can speak to every aspect of life, and emerging scholarship is attending to that, right? So that is key to, and there are courses being created around that. So there is a Caribbean, climate justice in the Caribbean course, right, at Brooklyn College. And so absolutely that work is happening. And so that is important. Every single field should have some component of Puerto Rican studies in it. Anybody else want to contribute?
Yeah, I would just say that I'm grateful for that question. It's another area that I'm interested in and working. And there's a lot of overlap or similarity or space for solidarity between the movements for autogestión in Puerto Rico and for renewable energy and the climate justice and environmental justice struggles here in the United States, right? So there's places where we should seek to support projects in Puerto Rico like Casa Pueblo, Queremos Sol, all these projects that are trying to transition away from fossil fuels, which is very much part and parcel of Puerto Rico's struggle for self-determination and decolonization, and some of the climate justice work that's being done here. So it's a lot of work being done and a lot of space for additional work and opportunities for collaboration and solidarity.